Welcome to the Deep Dive. Today, we're really getting into the details of Sundaram Finance Holdings Ltd, SFHL.
That's right. We've got a whole stack of their annual reports here.
Yeah, quite a bit. We're looking at reports from, 2017-18, right up to 2022-23.
And the AGM notices, too, for the last couple of years, 22-23 and 23-24, plus that business responsibility report framework.
And we'll pull in bits from Sundaram Business Services, SBSL, where it helps paint the picture.
Definitely.
So the mission for you listening is, well, to get a solid grip on where SFHL stands. We want to cover its performance, its governance, maybe where it's heading.
Exactly. Without getting totally lost in the weeds of financial jargon, we'll try to pull out the really key stuff, maybe some surprising bits, too.
Okay, great. So where should we start? Maybe with who's actually in charge, the governance side.
Sounds good. Looking at those AGM notices, you see some names recurring for re-election?
Like Srihar Chaviji. He was up for re-election in the 22-23 AGM. It mentions him as a director liable for retirement by rotation. What exactly does that phrase mean in practical terms?
Ah, right. Good question. It's basically a system where a part of the board has to step down periodically,
Okay.
but they can be reelected. It gives shareholders a regular chance to, weigh in on who represents them. It keeps things accountable.
But also allows for continuity if they're doing a good job.
Precisely. And we saw the same thing with Shri Srivatsram in the more recent 23-24 AGM notice.
So having these directors stick around probably means what? A steady hand on the tiller? Consistent strategy?
Yeah, likely. That kind of institutional knowledge is pretty valuable, especially in finance.
Makes sense. And the AGMs also tell us about the top executives, like Sri S. Ravi being reappointed as CEO for a year back in May 2023.
Right. And if you dig back to the 2017-18 report, that's when Paramesh Krishner was appointed CEO, and P.N. Srikant came in as Secretary and Compliance Officer.
So you can kind of trace the leadership journey a bit.
Exactly. It gives you a timeline.
Now, besides the individuals, the reports are full of mentions of board committees, audit committee, stakeholders relationship committee, nomination and remuneration.
Mm-hmm.
They sound important. Why are these specific committees so key?
Oh, they're absolutely crucial for good governance. Think of them as like specialized subgroups of the board.
Okay.
They allow for much deeper focus. The audit committee, for example, digs into the financial statements, the accuracy, the internal controls. It's a check on management.
Right. Keeps the numbers honest.
Pretty much. Then the Stakeholders Relationship Committee is there to handle issues from shareholders. Maybe dividends didn't arrive or share transfer problems.
So a point of contact for investors.
Exactly. And nomination and remuneration, well, that's about appointing directors, deciding how much they and the top execs get paid, trying to link pay to performance ideally.
Aligning interests, you mean?
Yeah, aligning their interests with the shareholders. And you've also got the Risk Management Committee looking out for potential dangers, and the CSR Committee for social responsibility stuff.
So lots of oversight.
It creates a more robust structure, definitely. More accountability.
And it seems they take it seriously. I noticed the 2021-22 report actually talks about the criteria they use to evaluate the board's performance.
That's a really good sign.
Yeah.
Yeah, because it shows they're not just ticking boxes by having the committees. They're actively thinking about how effective the board itself is. It suggests a commitment to, getting better.
Okay, interesting. Shall we pivot to the money side, the financial performance?
Let's do it. Looking across the years, you see some definite shifts, like that 2017-18 report mentioned a revenue jump right after a demerger.
Right, that must have been a big deal for them.
It usually is. A demerger often lets a company focus its strategy, maybe shed non-core parts. Looks like it worked out positively for SFHL's revenue then.
And then in 2018-19, wasn't there growth mentioned from Axles India Limited?
Yes, exactly. That highlights how their investments in associated companies really feed into SFHL's own bottom line.
Because SFHL is primarily a holding company, right? So income comes from its investments.
Precisely. Dividend income from those associates is a really significant part of their revenue stream.
And the 2022-23 report mentioned the consolidated financial statements are always included, which makes sense. You need the full picture.
Absolutely. That pulls everything together, subsidiaries, associates, gives you the overall health.
Okay, what about returns directly to shareholders? Dividends.
Yeah, we saw a mention of a dividend of 50 pays per share in the 2020-21 report.
So BO.50.
Right. And interestingly, way back in the 2017-18 report, they actually stated a policy target.
Oh, yeah?
They aimed for a dividend payout ratio of somewhere between 25% and 50% of profit after tax.
That's quite specific. Gives investors a clear idea of what to expect, potentially.
It does. It signals their intention to share profits consistently.
And they seem pretty buttoned up on the admin side, too. The 2019-20 report talks about transferring unclaimed dividends to the IEPF. What is the IEPF exactly?
The Investor Education and Protection Fund. It's a fund set up by the government in India.
Why?
When dividends or other amounts aren't claimed by shareholders for a long time, the money eventually has to be transferred there. The fund's purpose is then used for investor education and protecting investor interests.
So SFHL, following that process, just shows they're ticking the regulatory boxes.
Exactly. Compliance and proper handling of shareholder money.
What about who actually owns the company? The shareholding patterns.
The reports mention them, yeah. They list major shareholders. We don't have the exact percentages right here, but disclosing that consistently is good transparency.
And didn't the SBSL report break down the types of shareholders?
Yeah, the 2020-21 SBSL report did. Like promoters, institutional investors, retail investors.
Knowing that mix gives you a feel for the investor base.
Right.
Like, are they mostly long-term holders? Or
Precisely. It hints at stability, investor confidence, that sort of thing.
Now, this is where I thought it got really interesting. There was a separate analysis piece we saw.
Yes, the one highlighting their financial position.
Exactly. It said SFHL has almost no debt and high liquidity.
That's right. The debt-to-equity ratio was basically 0 for FY24, and the quick and current ratios were really strong.
0 debt to equity. For a financial holding company, that seems unusual.
It is quite remarkable. It means they're funded almost entirely by their own capital, not borrowed money.
Wow. So what does that imply, practically?
Well, it gives them incredible flexibility. They're not beholden to lenders. They can weather economic storms much more easily, and they have the firepower to jump on investment opportunities without needing to borrow.
So very conservative, financially speaking.
Extremely. And those high liquidity ratios, the quick and current ratios, just back that up. They have plenty of easily accessible assets to cover any short-term bills. It's a defining feature.
Okay, let's switch gears to the operations. Sundaram Business Services Limited, SBSL. What's their role in all this?
SBSL is their outsourcing arm, basically. The 2022-23 report describes it. They provide services like transaction processing, customer support, things like that.
To clients in India and overseas.
Yes. And the report gives figures for their revenue, their employee numbers. It's a significant operation in itself.
And they have their own risk management focus, too.
Apparently so. The 2020-21 SBSL report went into their risk policies, so even the support services side is focused on stability.
Makes sense. And back at the holding company level, SFHL itself keeps upgrading its IT. That was in the 2022-23 report.
Which is just essential these days, isn't it? Especially in finance, for efficiency, customer service, security, everything.
Yeah, you can't run a modern financial firm without solid IT.
Absolutely not. And that ties into their broader risk management, too.
Right. The risk management committee we mentioned earlier.
Yeah, the 2021-22 report talks about their integrated risk system, and various reports mention specific risks. They monitor liquidity risks.
Not having cash when needed.
Right. Credit risk.
Borrowers not paying back.
Exactly. And market risk, investment values going down.
So they're actively thinking about what could go wrong.
And how to manage it. Like the 2019-20 report mentioned using forward contracts to handle foreign exchange risk.
Hedging their bets, essentially.
Pretty much. It's about having strategies ready.
Yep.
And that same report mentioned the internal audit department, too.
Another layer of checks and balances.
Yes, focusing on internal controls. The 2021-22 report really emphasizes having adequate internal financial controls and reviewing them regularly.
To protect assets and make sure the reporting is accurate.
Exactly. Safeguards the company.
Okay, let's talk about the shareholders again, but more about how SFHL interacts with them. Those AGM notices seem quite detailed.
They really are. They explain the e-voting process very clearly, how you can vote beforehand or during the virtual meeting. That's in both the recent notices.
And they even tell you how to register if you want to speak or submit questions ahead of time.
Yeah, that level of detail about participation is quite positive. It shows they want shareholders to be able to engage easily.
Makes it accessible.
Right. And the notices also cover practical stuff like dividend tax. They mention the relevant laws and the need for Forms 15G or 15H for certain people to avoid tax deduction at source.
So they're trying to keep shareholders informed about tax rules, too.
Seems like it, making sure people know their obligations.
And they're pushing for electronic communication, right? That was in the 2020-21 report.
Yes, moving away from paper where possible. And they also encourage shareholders to keep their details up to date, PAN numbers, bank accounts so dividends arrive smoothly. That was in the 22-23 AGM
This is
notice.
making things efficient for everyone.
That seems to be the goal. And if you do have a problem,
That's where the Stakeholders Relationship Committee comes in.
exactly. The 2022-23 report outlines its role handling grievances about share transfers, missing reports, or dividends, things like that.
A dedicated channel for sorting out issues.
Right.
Okay, how about sustainability, CSR, and that sort of thing?
Well, they definitely have the structure in place. The 2021-22 report mentions the CSR committee, its members, and a link to their policy and projects online.
So the commitment is stated.
Yes. And we do see mentions of CSR spending in some reports, like the SBSL 23-24 one, and SFHL's own 2019-20 report gave some details.
And there's the Business Responsibility Report, too.
Right. The 2020-21 report confirms it's published annually, available on their website. That gives a much broader look at how they perform against environmental, social, and governance principles.
Though, interestingly, they don't seem to highlight specific environmental projects quite as much in the main reports we saw.
That's true. The 2021-22 report did mention they adhere to regulatory limits for emissions and waste.
So compliance is covered.
Yes, but maybe it's not a primary focus of their, let's say, public narrative compared to the governance or social aspects in that BRR framework.
Fair enough. What about how they pay their people? Remuneration.
The 2022-23 report mentions performance-based structures.
So pay linked to how well you and the company do.
Seems to be the principle. Various reports, like from 21-22 and even back in 17-18, outline the policy for directors, key managers, other staff. The goal stated is basically fair pay, linked to performance, and competitive.
And they review it annually.
Yes, the components of compensation get looked at each year.
Okay. And one last area related party transactions. Dealing with companies they're connected to.
Yeah, the 2018-19 report specifically states these are done on an arm's length basis.
Meaning?
Meaning on terms as if they were dealing with a completely unrelated company. It's about fairness and avoiding conflicts of interest.
And they mention material transactions with Sundaram Finance Ltd itself.
Which makes sense given the group structure. But
Yeah.
the key is that assertion of dealing at arm's length and being transparent about it.
Right. Vital for investor confidence.
Absolutely.
Okay, so we've covered a lot of ground here. If you had to boil it down, what are the main takeaways about SFHL for someone listening?
Well, I think the big picture is a company that looks very stable financially, almost conservative, with that near zero debt.
Yeah, that really stands out.
Definitely. Plus, a clear focus on solid governance structures and shareholder communication. And operationally, they have the investment side and the support services side through SBSL ticking along.
Any aha moments or things that surprised you as we went through this?
Well, the debt level, as we said, is quite striking for a financial holding entity. Also, the sheer level of detail in the AGM notices about how shareholders can participate. It goes beyond just ticking a box.
Shows real effort to engage.
It seems so. And
Yeah.
also that consistent message about performance-linked pay. It seems embedded in their philosophy.
So why should you, the listener, care about all this? What's the relevance?
Understanding how a company like SFHL works this holding company structure, its conservative finances, its governance, it gives you really valuable context.
Context for what?
For understanding the wider economy, for knowing what good corporate governance looks like, for being a more informed investor generally. These principles of transparency and shareholder rights are pretty universal.
Right. It's part of financial literacy, in a way.
Exactly.
Okay, let's wrap up with a final thought for you to ponder. Given SFHL's really strong liquidity and that super conservative capital structure,
All that cash and very little debt.
yeah, what might they do next? Could they be eyeing up new strategic investments? Maybe expanding what SBSL offers?
Or how might big shifts in the financial markets, interest rates, regulations affect their existing investments and subsidiaries?
Lots to think about there. It'll be interesting to see how they deploy that financial strength going forward.
Definitely something to keep an eye on if you follow the markets.
Well, thanks for joining us on this deep dive into Sundaram Finance Holdings.
Been interesting to unpack it all.